Welcome to the Inside Syracuse Basketball Podcast. I'm Mike Waters. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Luke DeCock, sports columnist for the Raleigh News Observer. We talked about Florida State's threat to leave the ACC, the strength of the ACC's grant of rights contract, and what the ACC could look like by the year 2030. Well, welcome back to another edition of the Inside Syracuse Basketball Podcast. And today we're going to take the conversation a little bit beyond Syracuse basketball. We're going to be talking conference realignment with Luke DeCock, esteemed and award-winning sports columnist with the Raleigh News Observer, Raleigh, North Carolina, located right there in the heart of Tobacco Road, in the shadow of the ACC's offices. Well, maybe not in the shadow anymore, now that they've moved to Charlotte. But first of all, Luke, hi, how are you? It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you, Mike. Yeah, not in the shadow. We were never in the shadow, but I was actually out at the Wyndham, the former Greater Greensboro Open on Tuesday, and there's a giant dumpster and a moving truck parked in front of the ACC's almost former offices in Greensboro, which are where we park to go to the golf course. So, yeah, sic transit gloria, and life goes on. But, good to be here with you and happy to talk about all the stupid things Florida State is doing.
Yeah, we're going to get to Florida State real quick. Interesting about that moving truck, though. I wonder if different schools are asking about a group rate for those.
Oh, you had to put all of John Swofford's stuff somewhere. So,
okay, let's get to the heart of the matter. And the real reason I reached out to you was because on Thursday, we get the news here that Florida State is having a big meeting of their board, and their president comes out. And they're talking about needing a radical change, in quotes, not air quotes, a radical change to the ACC's revenue distribution, or else, again, quotes, they're seriously going to have to look at leaving the ACC. What was your reaction to those statements?
I think they're insane or really stupid, one or the other. Sometimes it's hard to tell. There's so many parts of this, Mike. There's so much to unpack here.
Okay.
I've given this a lot of thought. I've been making notes. I'm still not sure where to start. Let's start with number one. Florida State spends more money on athletics than any public school in the ACC. For that, in the last decade, it has 23 ACC titles, 11 or 12 of which were in indoor and outdoor men's and women's track. None in football. The one they won in men's basketball was literally handed to them without playing a game. So I would argue Florida State does not need more money. It needs to get good at athletics, which it is not and hasn't been in a decade. But these Florida State people have this delusion, a lot like the Miami people, that because they were relevant a decade ago and people cared in the 80s, that Bobby Bowden's going to come back to life and everyone's going to care about Florida State again. And the reality is, this is a very rich athletic department that does a really poor job of hiring coaches, a really poor job of managing its programs, and does not get good value for its money. Their solution to all this is to get more money. So that's a little ludicrous to me. Number one, they want more money from the ACC. So they push through this new revenue distribution plan that rewards performance. Do you know who that benefits? Not Florida State, which has won 23 ACC titles in the last decade, half of them in track. It benefits Duke and Wake Forest, the same schools that Florida State complains about are dragging their football team down. Never mind, they've played in more ACC championship games than Florida State has. So there's that. Okay. Oh, all right, Mike. So then the other big threat from the Board of Governors or Board of Trustees meeting was, well, we'll leave the ACC. That grant of rights, and we can talk about the grant of rights if you want. That grant of rights can't hold us back. We've got a way around it. Well, first of all, no, you don't. And second of all these other schools, USC and UCLA and Oklahoma and Texas, you know when we found out they were leaving? After they left. So Florida State, very much, to borrow from Texas, all hat, no cattle. If they were to leave the ACC, which honestly, I've talked with a couple ACC ADs whose joke is, okay, they want to pay us $500 million, let them go. Because they're going to be playing independent football on the CW at best, on Flow Sports at worst. There's nowhere to go, right? The reason conferences expand, the reason the ACC added Syracuse, The reason the SEC added Oklahoma and Texas and Missouri before that, the reason the Big Ten added USC and UCLA and Maryland and Rutgers and the other one before that, I can't even remember. The reason that conferences do these things is because they create more inventory and more value for their television partners, who then give them more money. Fox in the case of the Big Ten, ESPN in the case of the ACC. For the ACC, it was also to get a network, to have a big enough footprint back when people cared about cable households that you could have a network. And, for the SEC, it's ESPN as well.
Right.
Disney's getting ready potentially to spin off or sell half of ESPN. Fox is not interested in the Pac-12. There's no television money out there right now. It is a very bad market to try to sell television rights. The cord cutting, saturation, the fact that Fox spent so much on the Big Ten, ESPN has spent so much on the SEC. Like, Notre Dame is about to have a really rude awakening when they go to market with NBC soon. The rumor I'm hearing is that they're going to have a couple games on NBC, and most of them are going to be on either USA or Peacock. Which is, to me, is like, that may be the thing that actually drives Notre Dame into the arms of the ACC. Maybe when they're the lead in to the Real Housewives of South Bend on Lifetime, that'll do it. Anyway, the point is here, and I've rambled on long enough because there's so much to cover. Florida State is snorting nitrous oxide because there's nowhere for them to go. There's no money if they do, and nobody wants them anyway. So this whole thing has just been so stupid. I thought after Amelia Island, where Florida State basically got its hands slapped and told to be quiet, among a couple other schools, that basically they're called their bluff, that we were going to have sort of a peaceful period of time. But obviously the Florida State trustees did not get the message. So that's my very long take on Florida State leaving the ACC. I honestly, Mike, I tweeted this. I think Florida State's going to take all of their girlfriends from Canada that you haven't met and form their own conference on a great television station that you just don't know about. And they're going to be fine. But the reality is there's nowhere to go. It's a terrible market. There's no appetite for expansion. Now, the one variable there is sort of the collapse of the Pac-12, but that doesn't really matter when we're talking about Florida State.
I posted a few comments. I didn't think they're on Twitter. I didn't think they were that controversial. I was just basically asking a question. Does Florida State actually bring enough value with them to convince the SEC schools to take them in and then further divide their pie? And of course, Florida State fans flood my Twitter feed and tell me that Florida State has like the highest viewership in all the ACC, and they have viewership this compared to the rest of the country, and how great Florida State is. Now, no one actually said, okay, here's dollar figures, Mike. Here's an actual answer to your question. They didn't answer my question. They just got mad and picked out one statistic that seemed to say Florida State has eyeballs. But sure, I don't know if the SEC is going to believe that. I mean, is the SEC really interested in Florida State?
Let's take this in the kindest possible light for Florida State and their lovely Twitter fans. Let's say Florida State is the most watched college football team in the world. It makes Notre Dame look like Le Moyne. All right.
Ouch.
Even if that were the case, no disrespect to Le Moyne.
Yeah, they're D1 now.
I'm just trying to. Do they even have football?
No.
Okay, so I feel better. Okay, all right. So good comparison. Even if that were the case, the reason that those eyeballs are valuable is for television ratings. The reason television ratings are valuable is to get more money from your television partners. There is no money. There is no money in the banana stand right now. ESPN laid off Jordan Cornette, the single most important person to emerge from the launch of the ACC network. Could literally do every sport and talk about them knowledgeably. A former ACC athlete, arguably the brightest spot of the 4 years of the ACC network. And they laid him off, right? ESPN is not interested in giving the SEC a bunch of more money because Florida State is jumping to the SEC from a conference that's already funded by ESPN. It makes no sense. If you understand how any of this works, it's just dumb. The eyeballs don't matter. What matters is the money. You do this for money. Unless Florida State's going to do their own deal with Apple, there's no money out there.
You bring up the ESPN factor there, and I was wondering, would ESPN officials actually tell Florida State, listen, we don't want you to go to the SEC. We want you to stay in the ACC because we have vested interest in both of these conferences. And if you left the ACC, you weaken it, and you don't add that much to the SEC's overall package. Would ESPN officials actually tell Florida State, stay where you are?
I mean, it's a great point. They should, and not only that, the ESPN, pays the SEC rights, has the network. They're finding ways, like the ACC, to put more value in the ACC network because they share the revenues. That's a rising tide lifts all boats situation. Florida State jumping to the SEC, it probably hurts ESPN more than it helps. Mike, I think the reason that conversation hasn't happened is I just don't think there are people in place right now at ESPN who are thinking sort of in that very, very big picture way. They're really trying, to use a phrase that you and I use, to get the paper out tomorrow. The state of things at ESPN right now is not where they're doing like really long-term strategic thinking. They're really just trying to bail out the boat and keep things afloat. So yes, I think in a different world where ESPN is more secure, they might, quietly reach out to Florida State and say, if you're planning on going to the SEC, we're not planning on giving the SEC any more money for you because we'd be robbing ourselves.
Okay, so let's assume Florida State officials are aware of all of what we just talked about. The reason then they come out and have this meeting and the president, Richard McCullough, comes out and makes these statements is basically they want this revenue distribution plan in the ACC to change. They want more money from the ACC than they're currently getting. And of course, that's going to come at the expense of Boston College, Syracuse, Wake, whoever it's going to come at the expense of, right? But if they have nowhere to go, is this just a bunch of saber rattling that's going to fall on deaf ears around the league?
See, I think what the ears it's falling on are their own fans. Think about it. If you're Florida State, your football team hasn't won anything in a generation. Your sports programs overall, despite spending more money than anyone else, are terrible. You're looking for a scapegoat. And the ACC, because it's third in revenue, is a convenient scapegoat. I would argue, as I said earlier, Mike, that performance plan they want so badly hurts them more than it helps. You know who wins ACC titles? Wake, Syracuse, sometimes Boston College, schools that are not Florida State. The schools barking the loudest about this, Florida State, Miami, and whoever, they stand to benefit the least. If you look at who would be rewarded, depending on how this formula works out, it's Duke, it's NC State. It's all these schools that Florida State claims are holding them back. So, no, I think the AD knows better. But to quote one of our favorite movies, I'm sure, there's a lot of saving their phony baloney jobs going on right now. It looks really good for the politicians at Florida State, the president, the AD, the trustees, to make a big stink about this because they know they're just like a toddler throwing stuff out of the high chair. Nothing's going to change. But this all looks really good for their fans. As you saw on Twitter, they got everybody all worked up. Oh, we're getting the shaft here. The ACC, it's holding us back. Like, look, man, the ACC is not what's holding Florida State back. The money is not what's holding Florida State back. What's holding Florida State back is Florida State.
To your point, Maryland has won about as many Big Ten championships since going there as they did in the ACC, even though they're making a whole lot more money now, right?
Yeah, and that's, there's two ways to look at this because we talk about
Maryland, by the way.
Hello, Maryland. We miss you. Sort of. There's two ways to look at the so-called revenue gap. Number one is when you look at the ACC vis-a-vis the Big Ten and the SEC, especially Pac-12, Big 12. It may have less money than some of those conferences on an annual basis distributed to schools. It has not been held back competitively. I mean, Clemson has regularly made the CFP. Obviously, in basketball, only the Big 12 is even in the conversation. The Big Ten's got more money than God, and it hasn't won anything in a major sport in decades. Like literally in basketball, I think it was Michigan State in 2000, and then in football, Ohio State, maybe. I mean, like I'm drawing a blank here, but it's not like the Big Ten has been winning the CFP every year either. The SEC, right. There's a little more case for that. I think the SEC's been a little, but the Big Ten's got all this money. It's got the best of the networks. It's done nothing with it. The Big Ten's like the Florida State of conferences. So the revenue gap there. Someone said this at football kickoff. You weren't there because it's football, but we need to be less focused on the revenue gap and more focused on the competitive gap, which there isn't. Now, here's where that changes, Mike, and you'll get this. If the numbers get really big, $50 million a year, and we get to a point where either the courts or if the NCAA is smart, collectively bargained, the athletes get a piece of this, when you have more money, you're going to be able to pay the athletes more. And that's where it potentially becomes a real competitive disadvantage. Nobody can say that because they can't admit to the fact that they're thinking about that. But when people talk about the revenue gap, what they're really thinking is, hey, it's not hurting us that much now, but if we can't keep it all, that could start to hurt us down the road. And I think there's some logic to that. Like I don't think that's a boogeyman. I think the revenue gap right now is fine. It hasn't hurt the ACC. Relatively speaking, it's not that big. But I do understand how if you're an AD or a president, when you look at these projections out several years and you have it in the back of your mind that, hey, we might not get to keep all of this at some point, I can see how you would be concerned. That said, I don't think threatening to leave and go, take your toys and leave is the way to go about it. But, obviously, look, if you wanted someone to defend Florida State, I'm not your guy. I think this is insane. I think it's bad for the league. I think they're hurting everybody by creating this uncertainty that, like, people like my dad don't understand how dumb this is. Like, remember the stuff, the spring meetings, this group of teams, the magnificent stuff, the single dumbest story of the college offseason news cycle. And we've managed to eclipse it with the magnificent one running around being stupid. It's just distracting everybody from big problems. And like, this is where Jim Phillips' legal problems really hurt. I don't know that he's distracted by that, but it can't help. And you really need a commissioner at this point who's wholly focused on holding the conference together. So I don't think it's distracting him. I mean, I think he's probably in a pretty good place of sort of at peace with handling some of these allegations at Northwestern. But you don't want to be a university president sitting there going, look, Florida State's full of it, and they're making a lot of noise, and they've got all bark and no bite. But I want to be sure that my commissioner and my other presidents are fully on board with this. So it's just the timing is terrible too, for Florida State to kind of throw this tantrum. But in the end, as I said, as I've had this conversation with ADs, they want to go. Hey, buy your way out of the grant of rights. Leave. Good luck to you. We'll be fine. And the answer is, the reality is the ACC would be just fine without Florida State.
Yeah, if it stopped at Florida State, I think they would be fine. It's just one team. You still have Clemson, Miami, North Carolina, Virginia. Before I move on to the next question, I do want to bring up anybody that's listening to us that maybe isn't quite as well versed in this as we are, because we have to be. When we keep talking about this gap between the distribution with teams in the SEC and Big Ten and teams in the ACC, I'm going to quote USA Today here. This is based on the fiscal year of 2022. Teams in the Big Ten in 2022 all received $58 million in their distribution from the conference. At the SEC was actually less than that. It was $50 million per team. The ACC was around $38 to $40 million per team. Now, listen, I'm not going to poo-poo $10 million or whatever it is. That is a significant gap. And I think the concern is that the gap's going to grow, right? The SEC's got a new contract that's going to kick in another year. It's $3 billion over 10 years. You're worried about that. And you put it in perspective earlier. Is that something that eventually some teams in the ACC, hello Clemson, as we get closer to the end of the ACC's grant of rights contract, that those teams could seriously look at leaving?
Yeah, no, as we look, the conversation changes as every year we get closer to the grant of rights and the numbers involved get smaller in terms of getting out. That conversation gets different. That equation changes. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that, everything I've said so far is going to be true in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. I would say that right now, looking at the scope of college sports in the Power Five, the question isn't how big is the revenue gap. The question is, do you have enough? Mm-hmm. And the answer to me is, as of 2023, the ACC has enough to compete at the highest level. The question is, because look, Mike, there's a certain point, and I think we're there, where you can only put so much water in the sponge. Like, we're so saturated. Look at the stupid things that schools are spending money on: lazy rivers, barbershops, flight simulators. Like, the money has to go somewhere. So at a certain point, when you get another $20, $30 million, the marginal return on that from a competitive standpoint is really small, maybe even negligible. As I said, where that changes is if the players start to get some of it, then you know where the money's going. It's not going to lazy rivers. It's not going to coaches' offices. It's going to be like an NFL team where things are nice, but it doesn't look like a college locker room because the money goes to the players. The money goes on the field. If college sports gets to that, then yes, that equation changes. But I think as of right now, I don't feel like there's a competitive gap. Like, does the ACC have enough to compete with the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12? 100%, absolutely, and the evidence supports that.
Of course, the ACC right now, we're talking about the ACC thanks to Florida State's recent comments. But the other big thing out there that's shaking up everybody is the Pac-12 is on the verge of disintegrating, it looks like. You've already got Colorado leaving. The Big Ten's already taken away UCLA and USC. There's talk of Oregon and Washington now. Arizona's regents are meeting, and by the time we get this podcast posted, Arizona and Arizona State might be members of the Big 12. We don't know. What are the ripple effects if the Pac-12 loses more teams here to either the Big 10 or Big 12?
Yeah, it kind of depends where they go, and it could be the ACC. We haven't talked a lot about this, about the ACC pulling a Big 10, but there's a couple schools in the Pac-12 that fit the ACC's sort of personality. If the ACC were going to make a stab at expansion, and I don't think they will, but if they were, I mean, the Oregon, Washington, Cal, Stanford quad makes a lot of sense for the ACC. They're big public schools. Oregon, maybe not quite academically with the other three, but certainly with the Nike money. I mean, that makes a lot of sense if you want to go that direction. I don't think the ACC will, because I think the ACC looked at what the Big Ten did with USC and UCLA and said, maybe that's not for us. Like, there's a line somewhere we have to draw. The problem, Mike, is, in the old days when, university presidents were like Bill Friday and they were all smart and good-hearted and understood college athletics. I've said this a million times, Bill Friday is the former president of the University of North Carolina and the North Carolina system. Mike knows who he is, obviously. He was the one who, in the initial days of the Knight Commission, came up with the idea that basically said, look, we just need to put athletics in the hands of college presidents, not ADs and not boosters. That's what we need to do. He basically cemented that as the way it is and has been. College presidents run the NCAA. That's the worst idea he ever had. If all college presidents were like Bill Friday, it would have been fine. But how do college presidents become college presidents now? Development. They're all salespeople. So they look at athletics as not how can we be good stewards of college athletics, not what's best for the athletes. It's how can we squeeze every last dirty nickel out of this. I think, though, there are some lines. I think for the ACC, that kind of geography is one, but it makes a lot of sense. So to me, those four schools are the fulcrum of what happens next. They make the most sense for the Big Ten. I think the corner schools, Arizona and Arizona State, make the most sense for the Big 12, especially with Colorado now. To me, the play for the ACC before Colorado left, and this came up at the end of Football Media Days last week, was to buy the Pac-12's rights, to put the Pac-12 on the ACC network, and be a rights holder like Jim Phillips and Jimmy Pitaro sitting down to work out the Pac-12 football schedule. But that would have done two things. It would have stabilized the college athletics landscape, and it would have created inventory and value for the ACC network. Maybe you rebrand it, maybe you don't. But look, the ACC is a 50-50 partner with ESPN in that network. Going out and acquiring the Pac-12 in conjunction with ESPN, Pac-12's rights in conjunction with ESPN, was the galaxy brain play here. And maybe long-term, what that becomes is the ACC and Pac-12 go to market together, and they're two divisions of the same thing, kind of like when the AFL and the NFL merged.
Sure.
And that way, you create sort of this bi-coastal marketing group that exists separately competitively, but together economically. That, to me, was the play. And then you have a 15-team ACC, and you end up with a 15-team Pac-12 with San Diego State, and you add a couple other schools. I have some ideas, doesn't matter who they are, but you end up with a bi-coastal sort of college conference. That's what I would have done, because the Pac-12, at this point, the Pac-12 is about to sell their rights to the Weather Channel, where they're basically going to pay to be on there. There's no interest. They took this Apple TV deal to the presidents, and the presidents were like, you got to be kidding me. We can't live on that. So the Pac-12 is in deep trouble, and that's that's what makes this Florida State stuff so crazy. Is you have an entire conference with Stanford and Cal and Arizona State and Washington and Oregon, big names, maybe not on the East Coast, big cities. and they literally cannot sell their rights to anyone. Like nobody is buying. And Florida State somehow thinks they're going to go out there and be this sort of wild card that's going to make somebody billions of dollars. So, I don't know what's going to happen with the Pac-12. I think letting Colorado leave was a huge mistake. I think not adding San Diego State back in March was a huge mistake. In the glory of the Final Four, you had a chance to really strike there while the iron was hot. I think that's what happens when you hire a glorified casino host as your commissioner, because that's basically all we've seen from him since he got hired. Although I do know some people who know him from that world and speak extremely highly of him. I think his performance has actually, well, first of all, you can't be any worse than Larry Scott, but I don't think his performance has been much better. And certainly, you look at the joke that was the alliance, losing your two biggest schools to the Big Ten, losing Colorado to the Big 12. It certainly feels like a leadership vacuum there. As I said, if I were Jim Phillips, if I were Jimmy Pitaro, I would have gone to the Pac-12 and said, look, we'll bail you out and we'll invest in your conference, and the ACC basically would have made money off the Pac-12, but really both sides would have benefited.
That's amazing. Yeah, that would have been genius of a plan. All right, Luke, it's been great talking to you. I got to ask you one more question. I'm going to get you out of here with this one. The ACC's grants of right contract runs out in 2036. So in 2030, at about the halfway point between now and then, so 6-7 years from now, what's the ACC look like?
I don't know, because so much can change between now and then. I'll say this. If there's still the same sentiment among schools like Florida State and Clemson, and very quietly UNC and Virginia that both spend a ton of money on athletics, if there's still that sentiment that they can do better by about that point in time, and maybe a couple years out from that, the ACC is in very big trouble. So there's this window here of 5, 6, 7 years for the people who want to keep this league together to act and figure out what they have to do to keep those schools happy. I don't think it's impossible. Florida State may be impossible, but again, they've got to have somewhere to go. But I do think that's sort of the window where now the numbers start to get workable. It's not as simple. People don't realize this with the grant of rights sometimes. I'm 99% sure you do, but people listening probably don't. It's not as simple as saying, oh, it's a buyout. Literally, if Florida State were to buy its way out of the ACC now and jump to the SEC, it wouldn't get any of the money from the SEC until 2036. That money would all go to the ACC. So Florida State could pay $150 million exit fee. Their rights still belong to the ACC through 2036. That's what grant of rights means. Now, the Florida State may argue that that's an illegal contract or there's no consideration, but nobody's beaten it yet. And Oklahoma and Texas didn't beat it. They ended up buying their way out of the end of it. They had to sit for 2 extra years. So that's even long, in 2030.
That's hard to go, not only having to pay your way out, but then also to go without.
Yeah, I think
cash inflow.
If there were people who were smart about it, that they would create a sort of escrow fund for schools that, they would pay them zero rights through 2036 and then, give them a balloon payment in 2037, and it would be securitized so a school could borrow against. Like there's ways financially, there's tricky little ways around it, but that's the gist of it. That's why it's so ironclad, or has been to this point. It may be 2032, 2033 before you really get to that precipice of that. But Mike, a lot could change in that time. An AC school other than Clemson could win a national title in football. Miami or Florida State could be good again. They could actually be relevant for a change. Notre Dame could join the ACC, which would change the landscape dramatically. I don't think that's likely necessarily, but I do sort of see a number of scenarios where that does start to make sense for Notre Dame. And that's the kind of thing where you can go back to market, whether that's adding NBC to the deal, or getting more money from ESPN, because Notre Dame does have that value in a way that, quite frankly, Florida State, thinks it does, but maybe doesn't. The flip side is all this is fine. We don't know what ESPN is going to look like in a year. And that's really the real variable in this is as ESPN's per subscriber cable revenues continue to drop, what happens to live sports rights fees in general? And are there new players? Is it Amazon? Is it Netflix? So none of this stuff can kind of happen in this vacuum. The sports media rights market is just a big a part of this. If there's no money out there, then there's nowhere for anyone to go. And that really is the case where we are right now. That may not be true in a year. That may not be true in 2 years. If in its search for a strategic partner, which is the phrase Robert Iger used, for ESPN, that ESPN and NBC Universal get into bed together, technically Disney and Comcast, that brings Notre Dame and the ACC one step closer. If their rights are now sort of held in a strategic partnership. So there's a lot going on there. So the answer to your question is I don't know. Nobody can know. But I do think the window for where this starts to get really tenuous is actually a couple years out from 2030. The numbers are still really big in 2030.
Well, it's all interesting stuff. And I tell you what, it's hard to kind of parse it all out. But I appreciate you coming on here and helping us with that, Luke. And unless things really change dramatically, quickly, I will see you at ACC basketball media day.
You mean if Syracuse doesn't jump to the Pac-12 before then?
Or who knows what, right?
I'll be there. You'll be there. Jim Boeheim will not.
That's right. I'll be there. We'll make it happen one way or the other. Listen, Luke, thanks again for joining us on the podcast.